Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we will be exploring psychokinetic weather control. My guest is Dani Caputi. She is a doctoral candidate in atmospheric science at the University of California at Davis and has given presentations on her psychokinetic weather control research program for the Society for Scientific Exploration and also for the Consciousness Society meeting in Tucson, Arizona. Welcome, Dani.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm a person who has looked deeply into the question of psychokinetic weather control when I did a lengthy field study with Ted Owens, a man who claimed to have extraordinary powers in that regard and demonstrated it many times. But actually the lore, the tradition of weather control is very ancient. It goes back to shamanistic times.
Yeah, and actually one of the things that I think might be worth mentioning up front is I don't typically think of it as control because that's how I kind of thought of it at first, because when we're thinking of PK or psychokinetic influence, like mind over matter, you're thinking of it as I am controlling this. But the more I looked into it with these, what these shamanistic traditions actually preach and what they actually tell us is that it's not about control. It's not about you having power over nature. It's about working with it.
More like harmonizing
exactly,
your consciousness with nature and then gently guiding it in a direction that you might prefer.
Exactly. And it's like, one of the things I learned is that sometimes it's not, the direction you prefer might not always be what's needed. And sometimes what'll happen is what's needed for the benefit of everybody. This is according to what those traditions teach who, seem to have some people that are very talented at working with weather. But that's the way I think of it, is that it's more about harmonizing yourself with nature rather than, having control over it. And I think that might be an important shift that we might need to make in sort of this macro PK type research where, because a lot of researchers are looking for very talented participants that we kind of know are out there anecdotally, but a lot of times they don't want to come into the lab to demonstrate their abilities because they think that is in a way, contradictory to their values, is about proving that they have control. So I think one of the ways we might, going forward, one of the ways we might try to approach this such that we can sort of unify our, Western scientific perspective with that more traditional shamanistic perspective is sort of seeing the value of both and working with them in such a way that, or designing our experiments such that they're more harmonistic in nature and not directly controlling.
Now that I think about it, there is, when you look in the folklore, it's very rich in this area. And I can think of one occasion in which, what was called a Hexenmeister, a fellow from, I think probably the early 20th century in the United States in one of these rural Amish communities, as I recall, who was a master of hexes and would control the weather. And, one day, according to the book written about this person, he was out and it was storming and he got angry and he started, yelling at the weather. You stop it. Don't you know who I am? I'm the Hexenmeister. And, he said, you stop it right. He was struck by lightning while he was cursing the weather.
Figures.
So, I mean, it's remarkable. There are other stories about the weather where, in the middle of a rainstorm, a Tibetan Lama was able to create, in front of a gathered assembly for a great Tibetan ritual where it was raining all around the participants of the ritual. Just in one spot, the clouds broke, the sun shone, the rain stopped, and everybody is warm and sunny while they see all around them rain falling.
Right. I've heard of that one too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you wrote a whole book on this subject with one particular person.
One person who believed he either controlled the weather psychokinetically himself or with the aid of other dimensional beings who he said looked like giant insects and lived in an invisible UFO, an invisible giant UFO that hovered over the planet. And but he would do things like claim his predictions were statements of what he intended to cause in his mind, and it would be heat spells in the middle of winter, cold spells in the middle of summer, controlling the movement day by day of hurricanes, affecting power blackouts, large-scale effects of all kinds, including volcanoes and earthquakes. And a very interesting story is that on one occasion, he was really angry. He got angry because he was having an affair. He was a married man, but he was having an affair. His girlfriend broke up with him, and he was furious. And that day, there were like 200 tornadoes that appeared all over the United States. And
tornado outbreaks.
Yeah. And it wasn't anything he intended to do, but he noticed that it correlated with this fit of anger that he had.
There was actually, that reminds me, there is somebody who is a colleague of mine. I'm going to keep him anonymous for now, but this is a weather colleague I had, and he was doing some research in Boulder for a summer internship. And this is actually, I wrote this, I documented this a number of years ago in that proposal that I wrote for like how we can approach weather influence. But basically what happened was he was in a situation where he was very angry, and there was a storm some number of miles away, but pretty close, and he threw his fist up into the air and lightning occurred at the exact moment. And so to him, that was either a crazy coincidence or he just created lightning.
Yeah.
And then 5 minutes later, he did the exact same fist motion and bam, that exact second, lightning occurs. And there were no other lightning strikes that entire night from that storm. Now I went back and I looked at all the data I could. The storm cell on radar looked kind of marginal for what you would even expect to even produce lightning. So, and just by the sheer probability of, what are the chances of those two exact events overlapping? You know what I mean? It's pretty low. So
what would you estimate?
I think I did a back of the envelope calculation, and came up with roughly 1 in 72,000. But again, it's hard to say because this was not a intended experiment. So you might make the argument, well, out of 72,000 events, something of this sort might happen. But nevertheless, it was very interesting, and it kind of, sort of woke up his mind to the idea of maybe there's something we're not capturing here with all this research that we're doing about, the physical processes of the atmosphere. Maybe there's a consciousness component that we're overlooking. Another recent case I can think of is the Reno Tornado in 2013. The one that was it's one of the most destructive ones of the past decade, basically. And it was very erratic behaving. And there is a Native American tribe, I forget exactly the details, but it was in the path of it, and they're basically saying they're the ones who collectively intended it to turn in one direction. So this kind of brings me to my next point, which is I want to make a distinction between, so I think the cases you talk about with Ted Owens in your book are frankly some of the best documented cases we have of potential weather influence. But I want to make a distinction between sort of large scale, big events like I'm intending a heat wave to come in 3 days, or a huge rainstorm in 3 days. It's going to rain for and snow for, a half a week.
Yeah.
Versus the kind of situation where you're standing in, let's say you're doing a rain dance on a clear day and the air is stable and there's no apparent threat of rain, and then a cumulonimbus cloud just develops and then you get rain and then it dissipates. Those are very different in terms of how we would look at those. So you might think that the larger scale events might be more of a proof-oriented thing where it's like you're looking at those and you might go, oh, well, that's more evidence because it's a bigger thing. I actually see it the other way because the atmosphere is so complex that these sort of large scale, long time scale events, you could try to model them, you know what I mean? And try to make an argument that it was actually consciousness that started the effect. But I argue it's easier to show that if, let's say, we have a case where it's a completely stable day, right? And this is in the middle of a drought, let's say, and the air is totally stable, extremely unlikely physically for showers to develop. And then you somehow do an experiment where you get a bunch of talented weather workers together and they produce a shower. That would be a phenomenal example of macro PK, in my view. And that would be very easy if we could do that under the right conditions, that kind of experiment, and launch radio sondes, which, capture temperature profiles going up and do the right kind of observations around it. That would, I think, be that would really shed light on what exactly is going on. What is this link between consciousness and the physical world? We could sort of really capture what's happening in this macro PK sort of environment.
Now, I have approached the topic from my background in parapsychology. To my knowledge, you are the very first atmospheric scientist to take a look at it, but maybe I'm wrong. I mean, you must have other colleagues who you've discussed this with, who there must be kind of an underground or at least folklore within your professional community regarding this sort of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because, some other parapsychologists have actually warned me, you really shouldn't talk about this stuff at your state in the grad program and, where you're at now. But surprisingly, my dissertation committee, for example, they're pretty open to the idea. Now, of course, in terms of what I actually write for a dissertation, it's pretty limited in terms of how much I can speculate into this world or how far I can go into the linking consciousness with it. But nevertheless, they've been pretty supportive in my ideas and supporting my sort of general philosophy of this is an interesting question we should pursue is, what is this link between consciousness and the physical world, and how does that play into studying our study of the atmosphere?
One very interesting study, now that I think about it, was done by Roger Nelson at Princeton University, looking at the Princeton University graduation ceremony, which was held outdoors in June, and comparing the weather for over many years on graduation day versus the day before and the day after. And he found that surprisingly, there was less rain, statistically significantly less rain on graduation day, which would have meant at that location, right? Which obviously would mean a lot to the participants, although there's no evidence that anyone exerted conscious intention to change the weather.
And that, to my knowledge, that's pretty much the one formal study that's been done on this. There was a graduate student, her name is Myrna, who I forget where she was at, but we were in touch a number of years ago, and she was trying to replicate Roger Nelson's work, and I gave her a few suggestions. The problem is See, I think we could definitely expand that, because that was done in 97. We have better radar coverage now and all sorts of ways of getting data. And there's, I don't know, there's enough it's been a little bit of time since I've read that study, but from what I remember, there were a couple things that I might approach differently. Like, for example, I think he just looked at whether or not it rained. I would look at, whether or not the rain crossed some intensity threshold. So I think that might be what people really, care about.
Yeah.
But yeah. So the point is that this has not been formally studied that much yet,
in spite of the vast folklore.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, I should acknowledge that there are, there is this whole sort of other world to this, where there's the cloud busting thing by Wilhelm Reich and all of that.
Yep.
And there have been some people that have done some experiments with that. The way I see it, though, is that it's hard to really know what's going on. Like, was that actually the orgone energy, or was that their intention? Now, they'll make the argument that they know it was the orgone energy and not their intention, because when they just try it with intention, it doesn't work as well. But my problem with that is, if they already have some preconceived notion that the orgone energy is going to work better, then of course it's going to work better when you're using that. It doesn't, to me, that doesn't really make the argument that that's not just a vehicle for intention.
Right.
And so that's kind of where that's how I like to approach this, is that I look at it in a fundamental way, like what is underlying this? As far as I know, this could all be intention. You know what I mean? All these rituals, all these, fancy names of types of energy we come up for this might be just our way of thinking about it. But at the end of the day, it could be all intention. So that's kind of what I personally am inclined to think, just by Occam's razor, sort of. It's kind of a simpler explanation. I don't know that for sure, but that's how I think of it usually.
Well, and certainly that's the way parapsychologists tend to think about it.
Right.
In terms of intention.
Right. If you talk to someone in, what's it called? Like, if you talk to a traditional, like, let's say a religious person, they would say it's the prayer that works. You know what I mean? It's the specific deity they're praying to. You know what I mean? And if in one case their prayer was answered remarkably, they might say, like, wow, that's proof of this deity. But I would say, no, if anything, that's proof that your intention did something in that case. But, there's no need to invoke an extra deity here. It's the same kind of thing with this cloud busting thing, the way I see it. It's like, what's really the need to invoke this orgone energy when we could just explain it with intention?
Well, of course, it takes more than a simple experiment to get at these questions. I think if you talk to many practitioners of a shamanistic nature, their fundamental worldview is animistic. And by that, I mean they perceive everything to be alive, including the wind, the clouds, are all at some level conscious and responsive to human thought.
Right.
And if that's their belief system, it may well be that belief system is more effective for people than to think that a humble human being with a little ego can possibly influence the weather.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
So it's tricky. You've got to deal with the pragmatic effect of a belief system versus the truth value of a belief system. They could be quite different.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to have belief systems. Like, I think I'm not against belief systems at all. I think it's just important to make a clear distinction between how far can the science actually tell us?
Yeah.
Versus what's speculative. You know what I mean? It's like the data shows that, okay, there's all this stuff relating to consciousness in the physical world that seems to work in the lab. I just like to say, well, what does that actually say? And just, make a clear distinction between this is what the science is saying versus this is my personal worldview of like how it all works and like the forms of energy behind it. Mm-hmm. I'm not against those philosophies at all. I like to distinguish what science is actually telling us versus what's speculative.
Well, one of the things that seems very clear to me from science is that, let's talk about the wave-particle duality for a moment. In physics, if you look for a wave in the double-slit experiment in physics, you'll find waves. If you look for particles, you'll find particles, which suggests that consciousness is somehow involved in what manifests physically. And some people have said, well, if it can be true at the quantum physical level like that, it's a very fine distinction between a quantum physical effect and the fundamental place where a chaotic or turbulent system is activated. It could even be a quantum mechanical event that could trigger a large-scale chaotic event.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where I think that we're kind of at, I don't want to say impasse, but we're kind of at a point where people studying turbulence and like macro chaotic phenomenon really should be talking to more physicists and about this quantum scale things. I think there are links between the scales that we haven't appreciated yet. And, I think we're at a point where we can really try to connect them. For better or for worse, computing power has dramatically, increased, of course, in the last several decades. And what that allows us to do is model the complexities of turbulence really well, And so there's a school of thought within the, atmospheric science community, and not just atmospheric science. Turbulence is relevant in ocean dynamics too, and other engineering things. Just want to be clear. Turbulence is not just an atmospheric science specific thing. But it is especially relevant in that. And so for better or for worse, models have become very good at simulating the complexities of turbulence. And what that allows us to do to some degree is bypass the more fundamental physical questions of what is turbulence, what is randomness, because it allows us to, if in our weather models that make forecasts for where hurricanes are going to go and model fluxes in the atmosphere that, contribute to all sorts of things. And, if in these models, if we can account for the effects of turbulence, some people might think, well, what's the need to really pursue a physical theory anymore if we can model it away? But I think we really have an opportunity here to discover something really more fundamental about the universe if we can go back to our interest in the physics of turbulence and how it manifests in the atmosphere and, see if there's a connection with the smaller quantum level scales. It's actually, and there's a lot we don't know. So I was talking to you earlier about how in the classical three-dimensional turbulence model. So just for the sake of viewers, I just want to be clear of what we mean by turbulence. So typically turbulence is something you experience on an airplane, right? But that's really the effects of turbulence, right? You can see turbulence when you turn on a bathtub faucet. It's basically, because water is a fluid, air is a fluid. Turbulence is the chaotic motion of any fluid. So you can see it in waterfalls. You can see it in air on the ground whenever you see a gust of wind or a sudden change in direction of speed of the wind. It's basically chaotic motion of fluid. And so, in the way that turbulence works, according to the classical model, is you start with these large scale eddies, we call them, which are like these vortices, right? And so those are produced by, large scale wind shears, like winds moving in different directions and speed at different levels of the atmosphere. Also thermals is another cause. And these larger eddies, right, then basically cascade down into smaller and smaller eddies. So the shears from the larger eddies go smaller and smaller. There's a nice poem by Lewis Richardson, and that's on my website. I don't think I can remember it, but basically the idea is that you're cascading down to smaller and smaller vortices. Mm-hmm. And so there's sort of this idea I had a while ago of what if there's a piece missing where the butterfly effect really plays into this, where maybe you can start a perturbation that's really small and that'll amplify into bigger and bigger vortices somehow. And so that's kind of where I think about this whole consciousness influencing weather thing, and maybe why, even though maybe an average person can't produce a macro PK effect in most systems, like the average person could not levitate this table, but maybe the average person with just a little bit of training or the right working with some other people could produce a macro PK effect in the atmosphere, like making a shower in a drought or slowing down wind speeds of a hurricane because of the effects of turbulence. If you're starting with a tiny effect, that might bubble up. So that's sort of my motivation into looking at turbulence specifically. Mm-hmm. And there's just one other thing I want to say about this is that I mentioned that we don't really, from our observations in the classical model, we don't really see small effects bubbling up. So, but I do have a justification for that, which is sort of that we do see it in certain environments. So for example, in the daytime boundary layer, as we call it, the layer of air that's, from the surface to typically 1 or 2 kilometers above, where there's a lot of turbulence, right? That'll be 3-dimensional because that's a deep enough layer where you're getting turbulence. But at night, we see that, the layer of turbulence is actually very shallow, right? We call that the stable boundary layer. And it's typically formed by, you have a jet of fast winds a few hundred meters above the surface and pretty calm winds at the surface. So that's causing a lot of shear of the fluid, and that shear is inducing some vorticities. And so, my advisor actually, gave me this thought, which I think actually, it makes sense. And I don't know if other atmospheric scientists have thought of it this way, but it kind of makes sense, is that a reason we don't really understand nighttime turbulence so well, and the reason it's so complex, is because it's actually 2-dimensional turbulence. And in models of 2-dimensional turbulence, we've seen that you can actually get that classic butterfly effect where you start with a very small change and that'll amplify tremendously.
The butterfly effect is, as I understand it, based on the idea that a butterfly flapping its wings in China could end up causing a hurricane in the Caribbean.
Right. Pretty much. That's the idea. Mm-hmm. Because it's just such a complex system, and it's very hard to say where an effect started.
I also gather that the butterfly refers to the shape of the, I suppose it would be the mathematical calculations involved in mapping out chaos and turbulence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. That's a good way to think of it. Yeah, so that's sort of my motivation for approaching this subject of weather influence with, how can I set up an experiment that might look for what's going on at the most basic level? I suspect it has something to do with turbulence.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about your research because actually one of the main reasons I want to do this video with you, Dani, is to recruit participants.
Oh, that'll be great.
Yeah.
So we'll put a link to the website.
We will put a link. Okay. In fact, I can put the link right now on the screen so people can write it down. They'll see it on their screen. Maybe we can even talk about a hot link, but at least we'll have a visual link for people, and we can repeat it in the comments section under this video. So that experiment will be running. People can log into the website and actually participate from wherever they're located.
Yep. Mm-hmm. That'll be great. And so the basic idea is that you will log into the system and sort of create a user ID. And in 30 seconds, the total experiment takes about 10 minutes. And the idea is when you're instructed to invite chaos, as we call it, your goal is to, at this site where we're measuring, you're trying to increase turbulence, try to disturb the air, make it more turbulent. Mm-hmm. And then when it says relax, you would basically relax. And it's pretty simple. It's, one session takes 10 minutes and, you'll, unfortunately, I do not have live feedback yet. I, might be able to get that in the future, but participants will be able to see their scores, mm-hmm. A couple of days or hopefully no more than like a day or two after they do the experiment on the scoreboard.
And perhaps some talented programmers who are watching can contact you and help you install the live feedback.
That would be amazing.
Yeah. So what, as I understand it, you're looking at sonic, what is the name of the instrument?
Sonic anemometer.
Sonic anemometers that are located in Platteville, Colorado.
Correct, yeah. So a sonic anemometer is basically, so we think of things that measure wind. They typically have a few cups on them.
Yeah.
But the problem is, if you want to measure turbulence, which is the rapid fluctuations in the wind speed, a cup anemometer is not going to respond fast enough to those rapid changes. Mm. So a sonic anemometer basically has transducers, which send out ultrasonic pulses between the transducers in both directions. And that is the case in 3 components, both the X, Y, and Z component. And basically it's measuring the speed of sound in air, which can give you the temperature. And then once you know the temperature, and you take into account that the wind is blowing in one direction, the pulse is going to take shorter than the other. And from that, you can get the wind speed. Mm-hmm. And, this particular sonic is recording data at 32 hertz, which is, so 32 times a second, you have a new data point for, not just one data point for wind speed, but one data point for each component of wind speed. So mm-hmm. the X direction, the Y direction, and the Z direction.
So this would give you a more precise measurement of turbulence than was possible in previous eras.
Exactly, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what you'll be comparing is the effects of the 30-second concentration intervals or invitation mm-hmm. intervals. I think you would prefer that term, as compared to the relaxation interval. Although sometimes, with psychokinesis, my sense is that very often you concentrate, and then you relax, and just when you relax is when it happens.
Yeah. So there are things I can do to actually look for that, which, technically in the formal hypothesis that would, if that's the case, that would count against what I'm looking at. Yeah. But if it does look like, okay, there's this 30-second lag, I could always run the experiment again, adjusting the lag times in the formal hypothesis. Another thing I can do is look at power spectrum. So basically I would take a Fourier transform of the wind signal.
Fourier transform.
Fourier transform of the wind signal to look at what size eddies are being affected. So in turbulence, if you take a Fourier transform, you will get a very specific slope in log space. It's a minus 5/3 slope. That is your classical, what we call the inertial subrange of turbulence between the production scales and the scales where it's dissipating. So in that range, you'll get a very exact slope. So if consciousness is distorting that in some way, and my hypothesis is right that it's distorting the smaller signals and that's bubbling up, you might see that the slope will be elevated towards the smaller end of that spectrum. You see what I'm saying? Or if it's working the other way, where it's actually consciousness happens to be working on the larger eddies and it's still cascading down, you would see that slope deviate on the higher end or the lower frequency end of the spectrum.
Well, this is so exciting to me.
Yeah. It gives us a chance to actually look at what's going on, I think, which is why I, think this is a good, turbulence is a great place to start with this.
Well, I want to encourage our viewers to check out your experiment and to participate. You're not looking for people who have highly evolved psychokinetic talent.
I mean, they can participate too.
Yeah, you're not ruling them out.
Right.
But you're looking at, the overall population. But I did look at your website, and it's almost like a video game in that you list who the highest scorers are.
Right. That kind of gives motivation. Yeah. In a sense, to
so
participate.
You'll be able to determine if some people happen to have special abilities. You might want to even engage with them further.
And I think I should also mention, yes, that is true. Because this is sort of a first pass at a large scale experiment that looks at weather influence. Yeah. I should emphasize further though that I would love to see data really at all times of day, because as I explained earlier, there's the daytime turbulence, which is very different from nighttime turbulence. And, I think if we can look for differences in different environments with different stabilities where turbulence naturally behaves differently, that'll tell us a whole wealth of information about what's actually going on, where exactly you're getting this interaction between consciousness and physical world, specifically the atmosphere in this case.
The acoustic anemometers that you're using they're operating
sonic anemometers, right?
Sonic, acoustic,
you could call them
sonic.
that.
The sonic anemometers are operating 24 hours a day.
Yes,
putting out 32
hertz.
32 hertz. So it's 32 signals every second.
Correct. Yeah.
24 hours a day. It's an incredible research tool to apply to this kind of project.
They're very large data files, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
But yeah, with exceptions of, occasionally it'll, very rarely it'll go offline, in which case I'll, temporarily pause the experiment. But, most of the time it theoretically it should be continuous. Another thing I want to mention, just to sort of motivate participants, is because something I mentioned in the very beginning of this interview is that whenever we're doing weather working, we want to sort of connect it with a larger purpose, not just I'm controlling the weather, There is an actual benefit to turbulence in this lowest layer of the atmosphere. And I can give one example of that. Directly from my graduate research, I was talking about at night how you have what we call a low-level jet that is, a layer of stronger winds around, in the case of the Central Valley we were looking at. I just want to this isn't everywhere, but in
Central Valley of
California,
which is where you live.
Right. And where there's a ozone problem that hasn't really been going away compared to in Los Angeles, they've been getting way better with with fixing their ozone problem. In the Central Valley, it hasn't really been getting better, and that's because the dynamics around it are very complicated. And especially the nighttime dynamics, and specifically what I was saying before about turbulence at night being very complicated. Well, what we think's happening, this is sort of the working hypothesis I'm putting out in a paper that's about to get published, is what this low-level jet is doing is, again, because of that shear, it's inducing turbulence in this lower layers of the atmosphere. And when you have a strong jet producing a lot of this lower-level turbulence, what you're doing is you're taking this ozone from the previous day, that's in this, what we call the residual layer above the jet, and then it's mixing down some of that stronger ozone at night and bringing it to the surface. So you might think that's a bad thing because, isn't that going to make more ozone at the surface? But actually at night, what that's doing is, it's bringing it into the surface where it's being it's undergoing dry deposition, as we call it, which is the ozone is being deposited into the soils and vegetation. And so that actually makes less ozone available the following day.
It's being absorbed.
Exactly. Yeah. So turbulence is a good thing in that sense, in that it's cleaning out the air. And it's kind of similar in the daytime too, where if you have a more mixable boundary layer, a layer of air near the surface that's mixing stronger, you're ventilating those pollutants more, you're dispersing them more, and some of that will get mixed upwards into what we call the free troposphere. So turbulence has demonstrable benefits, and I wanted to make that point clear, that this is not just an experiment of I am controlling the weather and I just want to prove that it's real. It's actually, increasing turbulence does have, it does have benefits.
Well, very gratifying to me, having done some early work in psychokinetic weather control, to see that you're taking it to a whole new level now.
As much as I can, being a grad student.
Well, but you've been focused on this for years now. I know, and my sense is that it's likely to be a project that you'll be pursuing for a long time to come. I hope so, and perhaps other people in your profession will take a deeper interest in it as well.
That'll be great.
Yeah. Well, Dani Caputi, thank you so much for coming to Albuquerque to share all of this with me. I'm truly thrilled by what you're doing.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And Albuquerque is nice, so I'm enjoying every minute of it.
Great. And thank you for being with us.